Hello again, everyone. This is the next part of our discussion of section 22, The Fall of Rome, for History 231, Ancient Mediterranean World. And we left off last time with a rather grim story of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, which was just no fun for anybody involved. That's the way it happens when things fall completely apart. And again, worth noting, the collapse was nearly complete. They didn't just have a political collapse. It wasn't just that the empire ceased to exist. It was that the institutions that made complex society possible, many of them collapsed as well, leaving only the church, only the Western Roman Church, alive as a major, well-organized institution. And this is going to have a huge impact because, of course, that church becomes the Catholic Church, which is why Catholicism is so very important in the Western world even today. But what happened in the eastern part of the Roman world while this is all going on? Well, first of all, the eastern part of the world, remember, is more Greek than Latin. Their language most people speak is Greek. In the West, it was Latin. So there are some really big differences between Eastern and Western Roman life and the Roman world. So that's something to keep in mind as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Eastern Roman Empire had a much shorter border on the north than the Western one did, which means it's a lot easier to hold off the barbarian hordes. And basically, the barbarian hordes overran the west, but they couldn't break into the east. So that's going to be a big thing. Now, the major city in the east, of course, is Constantinople, which is where modern Istanbul is. So if you ever have a chance to go to Turkey, go to Istanbul, take a nice ride on the boat. It's great fun, have a nice dinner. It's a wonderful city, and the Turks are very, very nice people. And so this is something you should all do. But keep in mind, this used to be Constantinople before it was Istanbul. All right, so what do we see here? All right, well, first of all, religion is a big deal here. Christianity has really become dominant here. And remember, we're now talking not about subordinationalist Christianity, but the Trinitarian Nicene views of Christianity. And in the 5th century AD, you have four major churches in the Roman world: Antioch, Rome, Alexandria, and Constantinople. Those are the big ones. Now, there are lots of other ones, but these are the big ones. And if you are the bishop, the head guy in one of those, you have some real power, some real political power here. Now, keep in mind that this means power politically. It means theology is now mixing with politics in the way the church works. And this, of course, has high stakes, because if you win these political games, you're going to get a lot of money, a lot of wealth, a lot of power, and if you lose them, it can literally cost you your life. So that is something that is going to be going on. All right, we see a lot of conflict between, say, the church in Alexandria and the one in Antioch, for example. Obviously, Constantinople is really important because that's where the Emperor of the East is going to live, and that's a big thing. Rome, of course, has the papacy. So even after the Western Roman Empire collapses, the papacy hangs on. So they're going to continue to be important. These are very powerful, powerful places. And again, there are smaller churches in places like Jerusalem and so forth, but they're not the major players here. Now, a problem emerges during this time, okay? And it's a problem that Christianity has long struggled with. And here's the problem. What is the nature of Christ? What is the nature of Christ? Who and what is Christ? This is kind of important if you're a Christian. I mean, it really is kind of a big deal. So now they're going to have to try and figure this out. But remember, the stakes are very high because money is involved, power, politics, all those things are going to be involved. Now, as the Western Empire in particular is getting attacked by barbarians, all sorts of other sorts of things are happening, the East has its own problems, and that particularly includes the Sasanian Persian Empire to the east. Now, the Sasanians we've already met. The Sasanians, of course, were big-time, hardcore, Orthodox, intolerant Zoroastrians. And they can be pretty rough, too. So there's a religious aspect to this war. It's a battle, really, between Christianity and Zoroastrianism that's playing out politically, which, of course, is terribly ironic because neither Christianity nor Zoroastrianism started out with any power at all. And, of course, they only got power when they got associated with empires, right? So this is an important thing to keep in mind. The politics that is playing out, the religion is sort of window dressing to some of it, but it also is a big motivator for why people are fighting and killing each other here between these two groups here. So this is a big thing here. Now, keep in mind that Theodosius, we already talked about Theodosius, had pretty much said Christianity, and not the subordinationalists, but the Nicenes, are the main guys here. A new and refined Nicene creed emerges when he does this here, but this may settle the question of what is the Trinity, but it opens a new serious problem. A very serious problem. Let me lay this out for you, all right? If Christ is synonymous with God, if Christ is the same as God, then this means, how can Christ suffer and die on the cross? Remember, the central thing in Christianity, the reason Easter is such a big deal in Christianity, is that Christ dies on the cross for the sins of mankind. This is the whole point. So, if Christ is the same as God, how can he suffer and die on the cross? Because you cannot kill God. Sorry, you can't do it. Right? God is immortal. He's big. He's omnipotent. So you nail God to a cross, he's going to hang out there for a while, then maybe you'll go out and have a beer, then he'll come back. You cannot kill God. You can't do it. But in order for Christianity to work, Christ has to die on the cross and rise on Easter. So this is a serious problem. How can Christ be the same thing as God? Now, of course, if you are a subordinationalist, there's no problem at all, because God and Christ are separate. So Christ could suffer and die on the cross, God can be separate, it's no big deal. So the subordinationalists are like, well, there's no problem for us. But the Trinitarians, they got a problem here, because Christ and God are the same for them. And this is a serious problem, and it's one that people have been wrestling with ever since. And a fellow named Nestorius, an Eastern Christian thinker and bishop, he was trying to solve this problem. He's the Patriarch of Constantinople, so he's a powerful, powerful guy, and in 428 AD, he tries to settle this question. He says, here's the way it works, okay? There is Christ and God, and they're the same, but they're also separate, all right? Christ is here, God is here, Christ is human, God is divine, Christ can suffer, God cannot. We separate the two of them. We separate the two of them because what we're going to do is say that God has two natures. One is divine and one is human. The human can suffer and die on the cross, the divine does not. This is how he tried to solve this problem. And you got to give the guy credit. He's trying to figure out something which is really almost an unsolvable problem. And so he's trying to solve this. And what Nestorius does is he says, what we have to do is focus on the human side of Christ. We got to focus on the human side of Christ. That's the thing we really got to get our attention to, because that's the one that can die on the cross for our sins, and the whole Christian thing comes from that. And this is what he does here. This is what he does. The problem is this. Politics is going to come in. And the politics is going to get nasty, 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 because we're talking about very high stakes here. Whoever wins this is going to get a lot of money, a lot of power, and whoever loses it might even lose their life. So who doesn't like it? A guy named Cyril, C-Y-R-I-L, Cyril. And old Cyril, he says, no. He says, Nestorius, you are an evil, wicked heretic. You're denying Christ. You're denying Christianity. You're coming up with something totally different, and it's not okay. Now, what he's really doing is playing politics. He wants more power for his church at the expense of the church in Constantinople. So this is what we start to see. And what our friend Cyril says, he says, listen to me. Christ is the same as God, full stop, period. And that means that Christ is a divinity appearing in human form. Get used to it, deal with it, and do not argue, because if you argue, you should be, well, killed. All right? So this dispute gets really nasty, but of course it's a political dispute as much as anything else. It's between the different Christian centers, places like Antioch and Alexandria, places like Constantinople, who are all playing the game. The game is power, the game is wealth, the game is money, and the stakes are extremely, extremely high here. All right, extremely high. So this is going to be a really tricky problem. So Cyril comes up with the idea, and I'm going to have to read this here, called the Hypostatic Union, which means the two natures of Christ form a dynamic unity. That sounds fine. I'm not sure quite what that means, but he's trying to have his cake and eat it too, is what it really does sound like. And he draws upon the doctrine of one nature, the notion of, hey, this is the way it all works here. So how do you solve this? Okay, you got these two guys, they're both powerful, they both have important churches, they're both connected. How do you settle this problem? Well, the way they did it is they called councils. They get all of the bishops together, all these really smart guys, and they put them all together, and they sit them down, and they say, okay, guys, work it out. right? Deal with it. Work it out. This is a nice political solution to a difficult problem. So this is what they do. We will set up the Council of Ephesus here. We'll settle the dispute, and here's what happens, okay? Good old Cyril wins. He gets help from the Pope in the West, who is going to be playing in this as well, and he wins. But here's the problem. Political solutions can be won this way. Religious ones cannot. You can't just say to someone, this council just decided the way it's going to be and you have to believe this now. People don't do that with religion. With religion, you have to convince people. You've got to convince people. Forced conversion is a very risky thing, and it almost never really works. It might drive people underground, but it almost never really works. Because remember, for all these people, they really believe their very soul, their immortal soul, was at stake if they got this thing wrong. So this is going to be a big deal. So what we start having is two groups in the Eastern Church, two major groups, and one of them are going to be called the Nestorians, or what we call the Nestorians here, and the other are called the Monophysites. And the Monophysites say Christ and God are the same, get used to it. That's basically their argument, and the Nestorians say Christ and God are separate, all right? Now, they're the same, but separate, all right? Remember, God has two features in Nestorian thinking. So he's not a subordinationalist. He's not doing a subordinationalist thing. What he's doing is he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. All right, and the Monophysites are saying, no, they're the same, get used to it. That's kind of their argument here. And this is going to be an ongoing dispute between the two sides, and it's going to go on and on and on. Eventually, all right, you start having more and more synods, start having more and more meetings of these bishops. They got to try and settle this, but it's not so easy to settle. And this goes on and on. One of them is actually called the Gangster Synod. All right, they called another council of all these bishops together called the Gangster Synod because these councils would devolve into riots. People would kill each other over this stuff. They would actually kill one another over this. And this is a real mess because politics is starting to tear the Christian world apart. Which is kind of ironic because the whole point Constantine had all those years ago, remember, was to try and bring the empire together using Christianity, and now the Christians are tearing each other apart. So that obviously did not work out so well here, all right? Pope Leo I is a crucial player in all this, and here's what he basically does. He says, listen, I'm over here in the West, the empire's collapsing all around me, I'm the only guy with any real power, so he's got real serious power here, all right? And he says the Second Council of Ephesus, one of these councils, he says this is all wrong, this is very bad, and he says what we need to do is stick up with the Monophysite kind of idea here. He himself got excommunicated by the Egyptian bishop, so people are excommunicating each other all over the place in this mess. It's really dragging on and dragging on and dragging on. So what are you going to do about this? Well, ultimately, because it's a political dispute, the power in the East lies still with the emperor. The West is falling apart, but in the East, the emperor still has power. And in July of 480 AD, the Emperor Theodosius II, not the guy with the stars or the two stars, but a different one, as a namesake we can say, he actually fell off his horse. And he died. All right, and he died. And what this means is that the power politics of the Eastern Empire is going to get into flux here. And this gets really messy. The most powerful person in the empire is a woman. This is a woman named Pulcheria. And she's not allowed to be the emperor because, well, she's a woman and these people are sexist. So there you have it, right? And so what are they going to do? They're going to try and figure out a way to work around this here, all right? And that brings in a guy named Marcian, M-A-R-C-I-A-N. Not the same as Martians who come from Mars who have antennas, but rather this is a guy named M-A-R-C-I-A-N, Marcian, and she marries him, and so he's going to try and hold this all together here. But meanwhile, the western half of the empire is falling apart. Attila the Hun is running amok. It's getting really messy. And these debates go on and on and on in the church. And it's really a problem. This is a really serious problem. Eventually, they say we are going to have to come up with a solution here. A solution. And here's what they did. They said, okay, what we're going to do is call another council, the Council of Chalcedon. They call it the Council of Chalcedon. There's a mouthful for you. And the Council of Chalcedon says, I know what we'll do. We'll compromise. Now, compromise in politics is a good idea. If you get into politics and you can't compromise, you're not going to be very successful because there's no way you're going to get 100% agreement with any of your ideas. And that's politics. Deal with it, okay? But in religion, compromise doesn't always work very well. So what they did is they came up with a compromise position, and they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a middle ground here. How much of Christ is God? And they were coming up with numbers almost. They said, okay, we're going to come up with the numbers here, and they came up with a third solution to the problem. Now, what this did was divided things not 2 ways anymore, but 3 ways. All right, it divided things 3 ways. So as a result, today, there are churches which are Nestorian. They actually wound up in Persia. They actually moved to Persia, a lot of the Nestorians. So the Nestorian church moved to Persia. The church in the Monophysites, well, they got really big in Egypt. The Coptic Church of Egypt today, which is still there, 10% of the population of Egypt are Christians, remember. And these folks are Coptic Christians, and they are Monophysites. And then, of course, there's the Eastern Orthodox tradition, which is the compromise tradition. So what ultimately happened is the church in the East starts schisming. It starts to split into pieces. And it's really kind of interesting. And I'll tell you a little story. When I was in Syria many years ago, and back in the day, Syria was really a very nice place to visit. Nice people. Syrians are truly wonderful people. I love them all. They're really wonderful. But here's the thing. I would be in these towns, and Syria has a lot of Christians. All right? There's a lot of Christians who live in Syria. And I would be in this town, and I'd look, and I'd say, well, there's a Christian church over here, and there's a Christian church over there, and there's right next to each other. Why do you have 2 churches here? Or more? Well, one of them might be a Monophysite, the other might be Nestorian, and they didn't want to get together in the same church. This schisming, this fragmenting of Eastern Christianity continues even to this day, and it's something to keep in mind. Western Christianity is going to be dominated by the Roman Catholic Church because Rome is, the church is the only thing that survived the collapse of the Western Empire. The Eastern Christian tradition is a lot more fragmented, a lot more split, a lot more schisming going on over there. All right, and some very interesting reasons, but this is one of the big reasons that you start to see this here. And that becomes a very important point, all right? That becomes a very important point because this division of Christianity is going to have a huge impact on something that is going to happen just a little ways down the road, which we're going to talk about at the very end of the class, and that is going to be the rise of Islam. It's going to have a massive impact on that. But for now, we have come to the end of this lecture, and next time we will talk about the exciting rise of the Byzantine Empire. That will be section 23, so we'll get to that next time. But in the meantime, be safe, take care of one another, take care of yourselves, and we will get through these tough times together. So hang in there, and best for you.